Hello students. Today we're going to talk about the spinal cord anatomy and physiology in chapter 13 of our book. In this chapter we're going to learn how to describe and identify certain anatomical features of the spinal cord, discuss some of the functions of the spinal cord as it relates to homeostasis in the body, and spinal reflexes and what a reflex arc is. So the spinal cord is involved in processing reflexes that are initiated in order to maintain all of our controlled conditions at stable levels within physiological ranges. The spinal cord integrates the EPSPs and IPSPs, which we covered in chapter 12. Excitatory postsynaptic potentials and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. So all of that's integrated within the spinal cord. And then the spinal cord conducts both sensory nerve impulses up to the brain and motor impulses out to the effectors of the body. The spinal cord is protected in three primary ways. As you know, the spinal cord travels down the vertebral column. You cover the vertebrae and the axial skeleton in lab. So it runs down the vertebral foramen in the middle of the spinal column. So the bone protects it. There are connective tissue coverings that wrap around the spinal cord as well as the brain. And those three primary connective tissue wrappings are called the meninges. You may have heard of meningitis before. That's infection and inflammatory responses to those connective tissue membranes. And then cerebrospinal fluid, which is the life fluid for the brain and spinal cord, basically transports oxygen and nutrients and waste products to and from the neurons that form the spinal cord. And we're going to look at where that cerebrospinal fluid flows in a minute. The three connective tissue layers that protect the spinal cord and also wrap around the brain include the dura mater, which is a very tough, dense, fibrous connective tissue layer. You see right here where it's identified. I'm not going to put these pictures on the test, but we need to know where the layers are. So the dura mater is the outermost layer that surrounds the entire spinal cord. Just inside of the dura mater is what we call the subdural space. So there's a little space in here between the dura mater and then this layer right here, which is called the arachnoid mater. Just deep to the arachnoid mater is where, as we'll learn in a minute, roots connect spinal nerves to the spinal cord. There's also a space in here. It's called the subarachnoid space. This is where cerebrospinal fluid flows around the outside of the spinal cord. And then we have denticulate ligaments which anchor the spinal cord in place within the meninges. Just deep to this subarachnoid layer, surrounding the outside of the spinal cord directly, is this little bitty layer right here. That's called the pia mater. So those are the three layers from more superficial to deep. You have the dura mater on the outside, the subdural space, the arachnoid mater, the subarachnoid space, where cerebrospinal fluid flows around the outside of the spinal cord, and then you have the pia mater, which adheres to the outside of the spinal cord directly. Again, that's called the pia mater. Now, as far as the spinal cord is concerned, with its anatomical features, the spinal cord starts just after the medulla oblongata, and as it's exiting the foramen magnum out of the skull, the spinal cord then extends all the way down to the level of L2. If you remember your lumbar vertebrae, so we had 5 lumbar vertebrae, so the spinal cord pretty much terminates at L2. But then we have some extensions that come from the spinal cord that form what we call the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexuses that we'll look at in a minute. And all of those roots coming down from there is called the cauda equina. Now, there are two major enlargements of the spinal cord. There's what we call a cervical enlargement. You can kind of see right here how the spinal cord is a little thinner, and then it enlarges right here. That's called the cervical enlargement. And then it gets kind of thin again until we get down here, which is called the lumbar enlargement. Now, there are 31 pair of spinal nerves. So the spinal nerves have attachments to the spinal cord, which we're going to look at in a minute, and then they have branches that come off of them that are called the rami. So we're going to look at some of these rami and look at what their names are in a minute. But all of the anterior roots of a spinal nerve form a plexus somewhere, except through the thoracic region, at least down here and into here. So we have a cervical plexus. We're going to look at a brachial plexus. There's a lumbar plexus and a sacral plexus. Notice there's not a thoracic plexus, only cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. As far as the internal anatomy of the spinal cord is concerned, you're going to be learning how to identify the parts of a spinal cord in lab. We haven't done that yet, but nonetheless, let's look at what's in here. First of all, down the length of the spinal cord are pairs of spinal nerves. There's 31 pair of them. They branch off at each level of the spinal column that you learned about with the vertebrae. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae, you have 12 thoracic, you have 5 lumbar, 5 fused sacral, and then you have the coccygeal area. So there are actually 8 pair of cervical nerves, because the first pair of cervical nerves come off just before C1. So all spinal nerves have 2 attachments to a spinal cord. So this is the spinal nerve right here. So this little branch right here is called the anterior root of a spinal nerve. And then back here is what we call the posterior root of a spinal nerve. And notice how the neurons enter and leave via a spinal nerve to come to and from the spinal cord. As it turns out, all sensory neurons carrying sensory information from the periphery of the body enter via the posterior root of a spinal nerve. And all of those sensory neurons, for those that are entering the posterior root, have their cell body in this enlargement right here, which is called the posterior root ganglion. So the axon then extends through the posterior root into the posterior part of the spinal cord. This is posterior over here. This is anterior over here. And that sensory neuron has several fates that, as far as synapses are concerned, they only show, one here. But the sensory neuron comes in the posterior root, and that's where they will synapse with either interneurons. In this case, they show an interneuron, or they can synapse directly with a motor neuron. The motor neurons in this picture is the red and this little green colored one. But nonetheless, we always have sensory information coming in the back, posterior part of the spinal cord, and we have motor information leaving the anterior root, from the anterior part of the spinal cord through the anterior root to enter the spinal nerve, and those nerve impulses then are conducted to all the effectors in the body, like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, so forth and so on. So the internal structure of the spinal cord is also separated into white matter areas. That's the areas on this picture that look lighter, and gray matter areas, which is a little bit darker, and that's not really gray in the picture here. It looks more brown. But the white matter areas are called columns. So we have posterior white columns. These on this side are the posterior white columns. Then we have lateral white columns on either side of the spinal cord. And then we have anterior white columns right here. The gray matter is separated into horns. So we have a posterior gray horn at these regions. We have lateral gray horns along the edges, and we have anterior gray horns towards the anterior side of the spinal cord. Now notice these motor neurons. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in chapter 15, but the cell bodies of these motor neurons are in a particular place. The motor neurons that leave the spinal cord via the anterior root of a spinal nerve. The motor neurons that are associated with the autonomic nervous system will have their neuron cell bodies embedded in the lateral gray horn, whereas the motor neurons for the somatic nervous system, that is to say the motor neurons that innervate and activate skeletal muscle contraction, always have their neuron cell body in the anterior gray horn, just like this picture shows us here. So we're going to revisit this concept once we get into chapter 15. So we have gray horns, we have white matter tracts, which are all in what we call the columns. The white matter areas contain neurons that carry information up to the brain, up the spinal cord, or from the brain back down the spinal cord. The gray matter areas actually conduct information into and then out of the spinal cord. So what's not shown in the picture are some neurons that actually extend, their axons do anyway, extend up and down the spinal cord through the white matter tracts. We won't be learning all of those names, but I like to call the white matter area the superhighway of the spinal cord. Information flows up and down the spinal cord very quickly in the white matter tract areas, and information that comes in and out through the gray matter is what I like to call the on-off ramps from a highway. So you can exit and re-enter in this fashion. So sensory information always comes in the posterior route. Motor information always leaves via the anterior route. So I hope that kind of makes sense a little bit. All right, now the spinal nerves have the job of connecting all of our sensory receptors and all of our effectors in our body, like muscles, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and the glands, to the central nervous system. So in which case, all of the spinal nerves, which carry neurons to and from the central nervous system, are part of what we call the peripheral nervous system. This was introduced in chapter 12. So there are 31 pair of spinal nerves that are attached to the spinal cord via anterior and posterior roots, as I just showed you. Make sure you review these animations. I'm sure you've been doing that, so keep that up so it'll help you out a little bit. Now, let's look at the connective tissue wrappings that cover a spinal nerve directly. So spinal nerves are actually collections of many neurons, axons of neurons in the body. And they're all wrapped up in connective tissue. So you have no nerves in your brain and you have no nerves in your spinal cord, because there is no connective tissue in the middle of your brain or the middle of the spinal cord, and a nerve is classified as connective tissue wrappings of many neurons in one structure. So this would constitute the nerve, with all of the axons of neurons being wrapped up in connective tissue around it. So let's look at the connective tissues that surround a spinal nerve. Surrounding the outside of the spinal nerve directly, along the outside, is what we call the epineurium. It's the outermost connective tissue wrapping of the spinal nerve. On the inside of a spinal nerve, axons from neurons are actually organized into these circular structures, which are called fascicles. Each fascicle is separated from all of the other fascicles within a single nerve via connective tissue referred to as the perineurium. So the perineurium basically organizes groups of axons in one circular structure called a fascicle. On the inside of a fascicle, each axon of each neuron is actually separated from all of the other ones, also via a connective tissue layer called the endoneurium. So the endoneurium wraps around the axons of individual neurons being transported through the nerve that are organized within the same fascicle. So 3 connective tissue wrappings, the epineurium, the perineurium, and the endoneurium, organizing the axons of neurons in a nerve. Again, a nerve is a collection of many axons of neurons in one place that are organized and wrapped together via 3 connective tissue layers. So for that reason, there's no nerves in your brain, because there's no connective tissue in your brain. We do have a bunch of neurons in the brain, a whole bunch of them. Same thing in the spinal cord. But they're not wrapped up in connective tissue, so we don't call them nerves in the brain. A whole bunch of axons in the brain and spinal cord are referred to as a tract, not a nerve. So we'll get to that later on as well. All right, so let's look at how we have the attachments of the nerves in the spinal cord. And you can see here, this is a thoracic vertebra. And we're looking at the superior section, like down the length of the vertebral column. You can see the spinal cord in cross section here, but there's a whole bunch of these weird little branches everywhere. So let me tell you what all of these are. So first of all, a spinal nerve is where we have an attachment on the posterior section here, that would be the posterior root, and an anterior attachment from the anterior root. Where the posterior root and the anterior root join together is called the spinal nerve. Now there's branches from that spinal nerve. These are called the roots, the posterior and anterior roots. But when we have a branch, it's called a ramus. So there's a posterior ramus that goes to the back musculature. So there's a branch that comes from that spinal nerve. It's called the posterior ramus. We also have an anterior or ventral ramus that would come out and wrap around to go to the anterior part of our body, basically around to your thoracic cage and to your abdomen and so forth and whatnot. We then have these special branches that will come off of a spinal nerve. They actually will be introduced more so in chapter 15. These branches are called the rami communicantes. They cause for neurons that are associated with the autonomic nervous system to enter and then leave something called the sympathetic ganglion on the sympathetic trunk. So again, we're going to cover this in chapter 15 in more detail. But these are the main branches. We have a posterior ramus and an anterior ramus, often called the dorsal and ventral ramus. So let's talk about the plexuses down the length of the spinal cord. So we have a plexus that's formed from and the plexus is always formed from the anterior rami of the spinal nerves. So I want you to know a little bit about what I put on these slides. In fact, the information that you need to know for this test is going to come from this PowerPoint, so make sure you review all the slides. So the cervical plexus comes off around the cervical region, specifically between C1 and C5. So notice we're going to have letters and numbers. The letters represent the level of the spinal cord, really the vertebral column where we are. So C stands for cervical, and then the nerves are numbered. So the cervical plexus includes the anterior rami of cervical nerve number 1 through cervical nerve number 5. So that's how we're going to name the nerves down the spinal cord. The cervical plexus nerves, which I'm not making you learn all of them, but I do want you to know this one, the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is a branch from the cervical plexus, and it carries neurons to your diaphragm and causes your diaphragm to contract, which allows you to breathe. So basically the phrenic nerve is involved in allowing the respiratory system to work the way it does for you to breathe in and out. But nonetheless, in general, the nerves from the cervical plexus, you can see them all in bold type. Don't go and learn all of those. But the nerves from the cervical plexus pretty much supplies the skin and all the muscles in your head and your neck region and the upper parts or superior portions of your shoulders, your chest, and then the diaphragm specifically by the phrenic nerve. The brachial plexus is formed from the spinal nerves C5 through C8, so the rest of the cervical nerves, and then the first thoracic nerve. So from T2 down to T12 is where we don't have a plexus. So the brachial plexus provides most of the inputs for all of the muscles and structures in your shoulders and your arms, your upper limbs. We have a few main nerves that are of some importance. We have what's called the median nerve. It actually has a couple of little heads to it, lateral and a medial head. I'm not going to worry about those, but we have a median nerve, we have a radial nerve, and this ulnar nerve. You have other nerves that come off, but these three extend down our arm. So let's talk about them a little bit and what the other major nerves are. So we have an axillary branch that's going to go to the structures and musculature around your armpit, the musculocutaneous nerve, and the three that I just mentioned, the radial, median, and ulnar nerve. So I want you to know that these are some main nerves that come off the brachial plexus, and also with the brachial plexus, in particular, the median nerve and the ulnar nerve when we have problems with it. So if we have injuries to our brachial plexus, one problem is what we call an Herb Duchenne palsy, or what we call a waiter's tip. So in this picture, you can see that the individual has a flexed wrist, and really the fingers would be flexed. They just don't show it all that well, but the wrist is flexed, and they lose sensation down the medial to lateral part of the arm, and have the inability to extend the wrist and fingers. So they can't make their wrist straighten back up, in other words. That's called the Herb Duchenne palsy. Now, the lumbar plexus is formed by the anterior rami of L1 to L4. So lumbar nerve number 1 to lumbar nerve number 4. And these nerves help supply the anterior and lateral portions of your abdominal cavity, your wall, and the external genitalia, and the lower parts of our body, which includes our legs, our lower limbs. So all of the anterior lateral part of your abdominal wall, the external genitalia, and your legs are supplied by some of these nerves. I listed two important ones, the femoral nerves and the obturator nerves. So just know those, although we have these other branches that come off. Just know what I wrote in this picture. The sacral plexus is formed from L4 to L5 and sacral 1 through 4. So I want you to know which nerves supply each plexus. That's why I wrote this at the top of each one of those slides. So the sacral plexus supplies the muscles in the buttocks and the structures in the perineum. The perineum is the bottom part of the groin area in the middle. The medial aspect of it's called the perineum, and then also have branches that go to your lower legs. One thing of importance here for the sacral plexus is the largest of the nerves that go down our legs, which is called the sciatic nerve, gives rise from the sacral plexus. And you can see here, if you look close in the picture, they show the common fibular and the tibial branches. So ultimately, these would branch down our leg. And I'm sure you heard of sciatica before, inflammatory response to the sciatic nerve, kind of painful. So the sciatic nerve is coming from the sacral plexus, not the lumbar plexus. Now, what about the physiology of the spinal cord? I kind of hinted on this earlier. The spinal cord is involved in maintaining homeostasis by integrating sensory information and motor information and propagating impulses where they need to go. So we're not learning all of the tracts in a spinal cord, but again, I want you to know the white matter tracts conduct nerve impulses to and from the brain up and down the spinal cord, whereas the gray matter receives and integrates incoming and outgoing, or what I should say, sensory information and motor information, respectively, that are involved in initiating and performing spinal reflexes. So we need to talk about what reflexes are and what a reflex arc is. So reflexes are fast, typically fast, involuntary, unplanned responses to particular stimulation. That means, for instance, if you go to swallow something and you start coughing, you say, I swallowed something down the wrong pipe. Well, when you have foreign objects, fluid, food, starts to hit the tip of the opening of your windpipe, it causes for a very forceful reflex that causes coughing to expel it from your windpipe. So if you step on a tack, you lift your foot up real quick. You stick your finger in boiling water, you pull your hand out real quick. So those are involuntary reflexes that are initiated at the spinal cord level. And or some of those in the brainstem, but in this case we're going to talk about the spinal reflexes. So the gray matter of the spinal cord is going to basically serve as that integration center to control the spinal reflexes that will occur. And I want you to review the animation for reflexes. That's definitely going to help you out. And let me show you what a reflex arc is. Now this is also a linkable clickable link up here. You have to be connected to the internet to see that, like the other ones. But nonetheless, as far as a reflex arc is concerned, a reflex arc is the pathway with which information takes to allow the reflex to occur. For instance, this is a picture of a reflex arc. They start with number 1 and go all the way to this number 5, so I'll just follow it. In the skin, a nail or a tack goes in the skin, which is going to hurt. We have sensory receptors in our skin, pain receptors and other receptors that fire sensory impulses up the spinal nerve that enter the spinal cord via the posterior root of the spinal nerve. And there, depending on the type of receptor and sensory neuron and reflex that will be initiated, different types of synapses will occur. So this is just in general. The sensory neuron comes in and may synapse with what we call the interneuron. Interneurons, if you remember from chapter 12, are totally confined within the central nervous system. That interneuron then synapses with a motor neuron. In this case, the motor neuron, it has its neuron cell body in the anterior gray horn, which means this motor neuron will leave, ultimately always via the anterior root of a spinal nerve, and innervate skeletal muscle. So always would know what the effector is going to be for this particular type of reflex because of where this neuron cell body is located. So reflexes that are occurring in the spinal cord, depending on what type of effector is either activated or inhibited, is called something different. For instance, in the case of reflexes that initiate skeletal muscle contraction, the reflex would be referred to as a somatic nervous system reflex, because the effector is skeletal muscle. In chapter 15, we're going to look at autonomic nervous system reflexes, and because they control effectors in the body we don't have conscious control over, and we're actually going to break them down into specific types of autonomic reflexes. So I'm going to cover that in chapter 15. So this is what we would call a somatic nervous system reflex, and we're going to learn some terms. This is what we would call a polysynaptic ipsilateral reflex. So let me tell you what those are. Polysynaptic means that the reflex involves multiple synapses. So here's one synapse between a sensory neuron and an interneuron, and another synapse between the interneuron and the motor neuron. So we have multiple synapses. So that means we would have to call that a polysynaptic. Now, if we have the reflex having sensory information coming in one side of the spinal cord, and the motor information leaves from the same side of the spinal cord that's called ipsilateral. So this is an ipsilateral polysynaptic reflex arc. And so you see the terms here. Ipsilateral means that sensory and motor information enter and leave on the same side of the spinal cord. Contralateral is when the sensory information comes in one side of the spinal cord, but the motor information leaves from the opposite side of the spinal cord. And we also have to either call it monosynaptic or polysynaptic, depending on if we have one synapse that initiates the reflex or multiple synapses that initiate the reflex. In the case of somatic nervous system reflexes, we also have something called reciprocal innervation. Reciprocal innervation or inhibition is a situation where we need one muscle group to contract to bring about the movement of a body part, which means we need the opposite or antagonistic muscle group to be inhibited. So let's look at what this entails. What you're looking at right here is something called the stretch receptor reflex. Some people often call this the patellar reflex or knee jerk reflex. If you hit the patellar tendon with the reflex hammer, it stretches the tendon. This is the insertion of the quadricep group muscle tendon. Is going to insert right here on the tibial tuberosity of the tibia. And if you hit that with the reflex hammer, it stretches the tendon inward. So by doing that, we have what's called a stretch receptor reflex. When the tendon is overly stretched, to alleviate the stretch of the tendon, we cause the muscle group to contract. So if you contract your quadricep muscle group, it's going to make you extend your leg at the knee, and that's why they show this arrow with the leg coming up. This would be the outcome of the reflex with your leg kicking upward or extending at the knee. So by contracting the quadricep group muscle, you can then pull on the tendon, which would alleviate the stretching that we initiated with the reflex hammer. Now, reciprocal inhibition or innervation involves the inhibition of the antagonistic muscle group. In this case, it would be the hamstring group muscles, which include the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and the biceps femoris. So all three of those muscle groups that are on the back of your thigh, which you're learning, hopefully you're going to learn in lab, where to identify them, when they contract, it causes you to flex your leg at the knee. So the contraction of that muscle group, the hamstring group, would cause the leg to come back in this direction. Contraction of your quadricep group muscles, which includes the vastus medialis, rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, and the vastus intermedius. Those four muscles are called the quadricep muscle group, and when they contract, it causes an extension of the leg at the knee. So let's see how this reflex works. First of all, we have sensory receptors in the muscle and in and around our tendons, by the way. So we have this sensory receptor in our muscle called a muscle spindle, and it will fire along the sensory neuron, carrying sensory information into the spinal cord at the posterior root of the spinal nerve. And you can see we have several different fates. So first of all, the stretch receptor reflex is a monosynaptic ipsilateral reflex because of this branch right here. You see how the sensory neuron, even though we have multiple branches from the same neuron, this primary branch comes down and synapses with a motor neuron directly that leaves via the anterior root of the spinal nerve to go and cause your quadricep group muscles to contract. This is going to release acetylcholine on the muscles and cause it to contract, which would cause an extension of your leg at the knee and thus alleviate the stretch of the tendon. So this is a protection reflex to prevent overstretching of tendons. So we have the sensory information coming in and a motor information leaving directly. However, in order to get an extension of the leg at the knee, we have to inhibit the hamstring group muscles, or what we call the antagonistic muscle group. We don't want them contracting because the leg's going to try and come back the other way. So at the same time, we have what's called reciprocal inhibition. And if you notice, the sensory neuron has another branch. The reciprocal innervation or inhibition is called a polysynaptic ipsilateral reflex, because we have two synapses, multiple synapses, and the information, the motor information, leaves on the same side of the body that the sensory information came in, so it's still ipsilateral. So the reciprocal inhibition is a polysynaptic ipsilateral reflex. Now, this other branch that comes up right here goes to the brain, basically making your brain aware of the fact that the reflex occurred. In other words, you're going to know if your leg extends outward. You're going to be able to feel it because we feel everything in the brain. So we have a branch that goes up to the brain in our white matter tracts and the white columns of the spinal cord. All right, so just review the steps involved in this reflex, which is really two different reflexes that occur at the same time. A monosynaptic ipsilateral reflex to cause the quadricep group muscle to contract, and a polysynaptic ipsilateral reflex that causes inhibition of our antagonistic muscle group, which in this case would be the hamstring. Now, the last reflex that we're going to look at is a tendon reflex. And the tendon reflex is a reflex that prevents a muscle from putting too much tension on a tendon. So it prevents the tendon from ripping or tearing. So let me just re-clarify that. Let's go back one. This patellar tendon reflex, which is a stretch receptor reflex, when you hit the patellar tendon with the reflex hammer, it's going to stretch the tendon, which pulls on the muscle, and the muscle becomes stretched. So to alleviate that muscle stretch, we need to contract it. And that's what this monosynaptic ipsilateral reflex does. It causes the quadricep muscle to contract, which then shortens it and prevents it from being overstretched. In the tendon reflex, this is a reflex that's going to prevent a muscle from contracting and thus putting too much tension on the tendon and prevent it from ripping or tearing. So this particular reflex involves really two things as well. We have what's called a tendon organ. The tendon organ is a receptor in and around the muscles in the tendons that monitor the degree of tension on the tendon. So if the quadricep group muscle is contracting, it's going to want to bring your leg forward, because when your quadricep group muscles contract, it extends your leg at the knee. So if you are lifting a heavy weight load and you're trying to lift your leg up, if the weight load is too much and we're putting too much tension on the tendon, ultimately your muscle will be forced to relax with this inhibitory reflex. The sensory information goes up the sensory neuron, and we have a polysynaptic ipsilateral reflex that goes to the skeletal muscle and inhibits it. So the motor neuron is actually inhibited from releasing acetylcholine onto your muscle, and thus prevents it from contracting, and it makes it relax. And all of that happens because of these interneurons. Notice where you see a plus sign or a minus sign. The plus sign means that there's an excitatory postsynaptic potential or an excitatory neurotransmitter being released, and where we have a minus sign is an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. So in this case, this interneuron here releases an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which inhibits the motor neuron supplying the quadricep group muscle from firing. So when this motor neuron does not fire, the quadricep group relaxes and your leg is going to stop going forward. Now, to alleviate the tension even more that's being forced onto the quadricep tendon, we can also contract the antagonistic muscle group, which in this case is the hamstring group, which includes the semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and the biceps femoris. So we have that sensory information coming in saying, hey, there's too much tension being placed on the quadriceps tendon, and we have to inhibit the quadriceps from contracting, but we want to initiate or stimulate the contraction of the antagonistic muscle group. So in this case, the sensory neuron has an excitatory neurotransmitter released. The interneuron also releases an excitatory neurotransmitter and initiates this motor neuron going to the hamstring group muscles to fire, causing them to contract, and our leg is flexed at the knee as our leg moves in this direction. So that's going to stretch our muscle back out and prevent more tension from being placed on the tendon when our leg moves back in this direction. So make sure you just go and review the steps involved in this reflex arc. This is the pathway that the information takes and the outcome of the reflex. Again, if you ever have any questions, please email me and I will answer them for you. Okay, so before we end the video all the way, I just wanted to go over a couple of these terms with you. Just go and look up these terms. I'm sure you heard of paraplegics and quadriplegics. So I want you to know what these are. Spinal cord injuries can cause a loss of use of limbs around the body. Monoplasia or monoplegic is when an individual loses ability to control one of the limbs. Paraplegia or paraplegics have limbs on either the arms or the legs on both sides of the body. They can't use it. So a person that can't use their legs are paraplegic. Hemiplegia, half of the body parts are inhibited from being used on one side of the body. And then a quadriplegic is an individual who loses the ability to control all four limbs. So just go and look up these terms. I might have a question or two on that, but that's about it. All right, so if you have any questions, just email me and I will answer them for you.